Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. If you love slow, haunting stories that gently carry you towards sleep, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this little corner of the dark stay open. Now, get comfortable. Let your body grow still. Let the outside world fade into silence. Tonight, as the night grows quieter, the shadows begin to whisper and another haunting story unfolds. So, close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into this. They gave me my father's case files 3 years after he vanished. Not weeks, not months, 3 years, almost to the day, as if the department had been waiting for some internal clock to finish ticking down before they let me anywhere near what was left of him. A cardboard box, sealed with evidence tape that had yellowed at the edges, forgotten in a storage room that smelled of toner and old carpet. I hadn't asked for it. I want to be honest about that, because honesty seems to matter more now than it ever did before. I hadn't gone looking. A woman named Deputy Ransom called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice flat and procedural, and told me that per department policy, materials belonging to Detective Daniel Corbin, personal effects category, were being released to next of kin. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone against my ear, staring at a pot of pasta water that had just started to boil, and thinking, he's not dead. You can't release the belongings of someone who was never declared dead. But grief doesn't wait for paperwork, and apparently neither does bureaucracy. They'd simply decided, somewhere in a filing cabinet I would never see, that I was ready. I wasn't. I picked the box up myself, because I couldn't stand the thought of a stranger carrying it into my apartment, setting it down on my counter like it was nothing more than a delivery. It felt heavier than cardboard should. I remember that specifically, the disproportion between its size and its weight, like something inside had settled, condensed, the way grief itself settles in your chest, until it has a physical mass you can feel pressing against your ribs when you breathe too deeply. I set it on my desk, in the small home office I use for freelance work, the room where I pay bills and answer emails and pretend my life is ordinary. I stared at his handwriting on the label, Corbin, D, personal, his handwriting. Not a form printed by a machine, not a label typed and stuck on by an evidence technician who never knew him. His actual hand, the same hand that used to write notes in my school lunches, the same slanted left-leaning cursive that used to sign birthday cards, love, dad, obviously, like it was a joke between us. Seeing it there, on a box meant to be his final accounting, undid something in me that I'd spent 3 years carefully constructing. My hands were shaking when I finally cut the tape. I told myself it was just cold air from the window I'd left cracked open. It wasn't. Inside, everything was layered with a precision that felt like him. Photographs paper-clipped by case number, interview transcripts organized chronologically, a stack of maps folded into careful thirds. And beneath all of it, tucked against the bottom seam of the box like it had been hidden rather than filed, was a leather notebook I didn't recognize. Small, worn soft at the corners the way leather gets when it's been carried in a coat pocket for months. Pressed against a body, warmed and re-warmed. My father wrote in department-issued notepads. Spiral-bound, cheap, disposable. This was something he'd chosen for himself, something private. The smell hit me before I even opened it. Mildew first, the expected must of paper that's been sealed in a box for 3 years in a climate-controlled but imperfect storage room. But underneath that, weaving through it like a second voice under a first, was something else, something acrid and strange. I want to describe it accurately, because accuracy matters to me now in a way it never used to. It smelled like burnt hair, not smoke exactly, not fire, that specific, singular, unpleasant smell of hair curling too close to a flame, the protein of it scorching into something sour and wrong. I lifted the notebook to my face without thinking. The way you'd smell a piece of clothing that belonged to someone you missed, hoping for cologne, hoping for anything that still smelled like them. Instead, I got that. I set it down fast, wiped my palm against my jeans, like the smell might transfer, might cling to my skin the way it seemed to cling to the leather. I told myself it was old paper reacting badly to humidity. I told myself boxes in storage rooms pick up strange odors, that mildew does chemical things to organic material that can smell unexpected, even alarming, without meaning anything sinister at all. I told myself a great many things that year, actually, in the weeks and months that followed, because the alternative, that something about my father's last months of work had been genuinely, physically wrong in a way that left a residue you could still smell 3 years later, was not a thought I was equipped to hold. I closed the box that first night without reading further. I told myself I'd get to it eventually, when I was ready, when the timing felt less raw. I didn't touch it again for 6 weeks, but I didn't get rid of it either. I kept it on the corner of my desk, and some nights, working late, paying bills, answering emails, I'd catch myself glancing at it, the way you glance at a phone that hasn't rung, the way you check a door you're sure you locked, waiting for something. I didn't know yet what. I only knew that box sat in my apartment like a held breath, and that some part of me, the part that had inherited more from my father than his handwriting, understood, even then, that opening it fully would change something, that some doors, once opened even a crack, don't stay cracked. They open the rest of the way on their own, given enough time, given enough of your attention, given enough of the specific hunger that grief creates in people who never got to say goodbye. I want you to understand that I am not a person who believes in things. I never was. I grew up in a house with a detective for a father, a man who taught me that every mystery has an answer if you're patient and rigorous enough to find it. That fear is usually just a gap in information waiting to be filled. He used to say that to me when I was small and scared of the dark. Fear is just your brain doing math with missing numbers. Find the missing numbers, he'd say, and the fear goes away on its own. I believed him. I built my whole understanding of the world around that idea, which is, I think now, exactly why what happened to him, and later to me, was able to happen at all. Because I kept looking for the missing numbers. I kept believing that if I just gathered enough information, read enough of his notes, understood enough of what he'd understood, the fear would resolve into something manageable, something explainable. I did not yet know that some numbers are missing because they were never meant to be found, that some silences are not gaps waiting to be filled, but walls built on purpose by someone or something that wanted to keep the rest of us out. I opened that box anyway. I always open the box. That is, I think, the family trait that killed him, and the one that is going to kill me too. I want to tell you about the 6 weeks between that first night and the night I finally went back to the box, because I think they matter, because I think the ordinary texture of that time is part of this story too, even if it doesn't feel like the interesting part. I went to work. I answered emails about invoicing and deadlines. I met a friend for coffee and let her talk for an hour about a man she'd started seeing, nodding at the right moments, laughing when laughter was called for, while some separate, quieter part of my mind kept circling back to a cardboard box sitting on the corner of my desk like a held breath. I told myself I was giving myself space. That grief has its own timeline, its own permission structure, and that rushing toward the box wouldn't serve either of us. Not me, not the memory of him I was trying so hard to protect from becoming something ugly. But the box was never entirely out of my awareness, not even once, not for the full 6 weeks. I'd catch myself standing in the doorway of my office at odd hours, a glass of water in hand, some errand that had brought me there, dissolving the moment I crossed the threshold, replaced by the simple, magnetic fact of the box's presence. I started sleeping poorly during that stretch, waking at 3 or 4 in the morning, with no clear reason, lying in the dark listening to my apartment's ordinary sounds, the refrigerator cycling on, a car passing on the street below, and feeling, each time, a specific unease I couldn't locate the source of, until I remembered, freshly, as though for the first time, that the box was still there. Still waiting, still sealed, mostly, except for that first night when I'd cut the tape and looked inside before losing my nerve entirely and closing it back up. I called my mother twice during those 6 weeks, and both times I found myself unable to mention the box at all, the words simply refusing to form, even as I dialed her number, with every intention of telling her. Instead, we talked about ordinary things, her garden, a cousin's upcoming wedding, whether I was eating enough, the small currency of a normal mother-daughter relationship that neither of us had ever fully recovered after my father vanished. I remember hanging up after the second call and sitting very still in my kitchen, aware of a strange, guilty relief that I hadn't told her, and equally aware, underneath that relief, of a colder recognition that some part of me had already decided, before I consciously admitted it to myself, that this was mine to carry alone. That whatever was in that notebook belonged to me now, the way an inheritance belongs to whoever survives long enough to claim it, whether or not they actually want what's been left to them. There's a version of this story where I never open the box again, where I let it sit on that desk until I eventually move apartments, and it gets packed into a truck along with everything else, and somewhere in the shuffle of a new life, it simply stops feeling urgent, the way most unopened things eventually do, worn down by time into just another object in a closet. I think about that version sometimes, the life I might have had inside it. I think about her, the version of me who never went back, with something that isn't quite envy and isn't quite pity, but sits somewhere close to both. She doesn't know what I know now. She sleeps through the night. I wonder, some evenings, whether she's the lucky one, or whether the house would have found her eventually anyway, the way it seems to find everyone who fits its particular hunger, box or no box, notebook or no notebook. I've stopped being sure there was ever really a version of this where I got to walk away clean. My father, Detective Daniel Corbin, disappeared while investigating a string of missing persons in a town called Hollow Bend, a place I had never heard of before that year and have not been able to stop thinking about since. 6 people, gone without a trace, across 18 months. A pattern subtle enough that it took the local sheriff's department almost a year to even recognize it as a pattern, rather than a string of unrelated, unfortunate coincidences. That's a detail that stays with me. A year. 6 people vanished, one by one, spread out enough in time and circumstance that an entire police department failed to connect them until a 7th set of eyes, an outside consultant, a man from 3 counties over with a reputation for finding what other people missed, was finally called in to take a fresh look. That man was my father. He specialized in cold cases and pattern crimes, the kind of investigative work that requires you to sit with disparate, disconnected facts for long enough that a shape eventually emerges from the noise, the way a constellation emerges from stars that have no actual relationship to one another, except the story a human mind chooses to draw between them. He was good at it, frighteningly good, according to the commendations that came home over the years, according to the framed certificates that used to hang in his home office before my mother quietly took them down after the funeral we held without a body. He'd been asked to consult on Hollow Bend by a sheriff who was, by all accounts, desperate and out of options. It should have been routine, a week, maybe 2, reviewing files, interviewing witnesses, offering a fresh perspective before driving the 4 hours home to finish out the school year with me, to make it to my last swim meet of the season, which he never saw, which nobody in my family has ever mentioned again in the years since. He never drove back. His car was found on Route 9, the long, flat highway that cuts through Hollow Bend's outskirts, parked at an angle that the responding officers described in their report as consistent with a controlled stop, not an accident or collision. The keys were still in the ignition. I've read that detail so many times it no longer feels real. The way any phrase repeated enough times eventually dissolves into pure sound. Keys in the ignition, a cup of coffee, from a diner in town whose receipt was later found in the console, still warm on the dashboard, when the first officer arrived on scene less than 40 minutes after my father had last been seen leaving a witness interview. 40 minutes. Warm coffee doesn't stay warm for much longer than that, especially not in a car with the windows cracked, in October, in a town that sits at enough elevation that the nights come down cold and fast. Whatever happened to him happened within that window. Whatever happened to him happened fast enough that he didn't finish his coffee, fast enough that he didn't have time to put the car in gear, fast enough that there was no time, apparently, for him to reach for his radio, which was found charged, functional, and completely silent. No distress call, no static, no half-finished sentence cut short. Nothing. No struggle. That's the word the report used, over and over, in a way that started to feel less like reassurance and more like an accusation the longer I read it. No struggle. No signs of forced entry to the vehicle. No defensive wounds, because there was no body to examine for defensive wounds, which is its own kind of absence. A silence shaped like a person. No note, just an open case file, resting on the passenger seat, exactly where he would have set it if he'd pulled over to review something quickly before continuing on. And the notebook, the leather one, which, and this detail took me the longest to understand the weight of, was not logged as part of the case file recovered from his car. It was found separately, filed separately, under a name that was not his own, a placeholder designation, Subject 7, the same naming convention, I would later discover, used for the 6 missing persons whose disappearances he'd been sent to investigate. My father was filed as a victim before anyone officially declared him missing. I didn't know that detail for years. I found it buried in an addendum, a supplementary report filed by a records clerk, who I have never been able to track down, who left no other trace of themselves in the paperwork beyond that single administrative note. Notebook recovered from vehicle, catalogued under Subject 7 per Detective Corbin's own filing instructions, dated 3 days prior to his disappearance. 3 days prior, which means, whatever he understood about what was happening to him, whatever conclusion he'd drawn about the nature of the case he was investigating, he'd drawn it before he vanished. He'd known enough to file his own notebook under the same designation as the victims. He'd known enough to prepare, in some administrative, procedural, deeply him way, for the possibility, or maybe the certainty, that he was about to become one of them. I think about that a lot. I think about my father, a man who taught me that fear was just missing information, sitting somewhere in Hollow Bend 3 days before he vanished, filling out a records request to have his own personal notebook catalogued under the same case number as 6 strangers he'd never met, because some part of him understood, with the same investigative certainty he brought to every case in his career, that he was next. That's not a man in the grip of an irrational fear. That's not stress, not exhaustion, not the fraying edges of a mind pushed too hard for too long. That's a detective, doing what detectives do, gathering evidence, even evidence of his own end, and filing it correctly, so that whoever came looking later would be able to find it. So that I would be able to find it. I don't know if that thought comforts me or terrifies me more than anything else in this entire story. Some days it's both at once. I spent an entire weekend, early on, trying to build a timeline of his final days, using nothing but the official record, the interview logs, the mileage on his rental car, the receipts recovered from the vehicle. I laid it all out chronologically, the way he'd taught me, because I wanted to understand not just what had happened to him, but who he had been in those final hours, what his ordinary rhythms had looked like, right up until they simply stopped. He'd eaten breakfast at the same diner 3 mornings running, according to the receipts. Same order, apparently. Black coffee and dry wheat toast. A detail so mundane, it made me put my head down on my kitchen table for a while, overwhelmed by the sheer specificity of missing a man's breakfast order. He'd called my mother twice during his time in Hollow Bend, according to the phone records included in the file, each call lasting under 3 minutes. I've never been able to bring myself to ask her what they talked about. Some questions, I've learned, you only get to ask once, and I wasn't ready yet, that first year, to spend the only chance I might ever have. The Sheriff's Department's own account of that final year reads, in places, like an exercise in institutional embarrassment, a slow, halting admission that 6 disappearances had occurred under their watch, without anyone connecting them until an outsider arrived and did in 2 weeks what a full department hadn't managed in 18 months. I don't say that to be cruel to the officers involved, most of whom, based on the interview transcripts, seem to have been genuinely trying, genuinely troubled by cases they couldn't solve. Small towns don't always have the resources or the specialized training that pattern crimes require, but reading between the lines of their reports, I sensed something else too, something the official language never quite named outright, a reluctance. A sense that certain leads had gone deliberately unpursued, certain questions deliberately unasked, as though some deeper institutional memory in that department already understood, long before my father arrived, that there were doors in Hollow Bend better left unopened. My father didn't have that inherited caution. He was an outsider. He didn't know yet which doors the town had quietly agreed never to knock on. I think that's the real tragedy underneath the mystery, if I'm honest. Not that my father vanished, though that's tragedy enough for one lifetime, but that he vanished precisely because he was better at his job than anyone around him, because he refused to look away from a pattern once he'd seen it, the same trait that had made him the best pattern crimes detective in 3 counties, the same trait he'd spent my entire childhood trying to instill in me at bedtime, over homework. In every small mystery of ordinary life, he turned into a teaching moment. He taught me to keep looking. He taught me too well. I sometimes wonder if some part of him, near the end, understood the terrible irony of that the very quality he was proudest of in himself was the exact quality that would carry him, methodically, patiently, one connected fact at a time, straight to whatever was waiting for him on Amity Row. I finally opened the notebook itself on a night I remember with unusual clarity, because it was the same night my downstairs neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking, a low, continuous, almost mournful sound that started around 11 and didn't stop until nearly 3 in the morning, long after I'd have expected someone to bring the animal inside. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside me, and I opened the cover, and the first thing I noticed, before I'd even read a single word, was how ordinary it looked. Lined pages, slightly yellowed, my father's handwriting, familiar and steady, the same left-leaning slant I'd know anywhere, filling the first several pages with the mundane architecture of an active investigation. Dates, witness names, mileage logs, meticulously recorded down to the 10th of a mile, because that was the kind of detective he was, the kind who believed thoroughness was a form of respect you owed to the people you were trying to find. Interview summaries, dry and procedural. Spoke with Marla Denning, sister of Subject 3. No new information. Subject described as different in the weeks before disappearance. Unable to elaborate further. That kind of thing. The unremarkable scaffolding of real police work. The parts that never make it into television dramas because they're too tedious to dramatize. I read through maybe 15 pages like that, and something in my chest had begun, cautiously, to loosen. This was fine. This was normal. This was my father doing his job. The job he'd done for 22 years, without a single complaint filed against him. The job that had put food on our table and paid for the house I grew up in and funded the college fund I eventually used to become the person writing this account instead of the detective he'd probably hoped I'd become. I remember actually smiling at one point at a small aside he'd scrawled in the margin next to a witness interview, a joke, dry and characteristic, about the coffee at the Hollow Bend Sheriff's Station being criminal in its own right, separate investigation pending. That was him. That was so completely, unmistakably him that for a moment the ache in my chest was almost sweet, almost bearable, the good kind of missing someone instead of the kind that leaves you hollowed out. And then, somewhere around page 16, the handwriting begins to shift. It's subtle at first. I want to be precise about this, because I've gone back to that page more times than I can count, trying to pinpoint the exact moment, the exact word, where something changed in him. The letters get smaller. Not dramatically. You'd have to be looking for it, the way I was looking for it, the way anyone who spent a childhood memorizing a parent's handwriting on birthday cards and permission slips would notice a change invisible to anyone else. The loops in his lowercase l's tighten. His usually generous spacing between words compresses, the letters crowding closer together, as though he'd started trying to fit more information into less physical space on the page. At first, I thought maybe he was just running low on paper, rationing it, the practical explanation my father-shaped mind reached for automatically, but the notebook wasn't nearly full. There were dozens of blank pages left after the entries stopped. He wasn't running out of room. He was choosing to compress himself, to make his own words smaller, tighter, as though, and this is the thought that arrived in my mind fully formed, uninvited, and refused to leave once it had, as though he was trying not to be overheard by the page itself. As though writing too openly, too expansively, was a kind of exposure he'd become afraid of. I sat with that thought for a long time before I let myself keep reading, the tea in my mug gone from warm to room temperature, to something approaching cold, the dog downstairs still barking its low, mournful complaint into the night. When I did keep going, the entries themselves had started to change too, not just the shape of the letters, but the content underneath them. Fewer mileage logs, fewer procedural summaries, more fragments, more questions directed at no one, at the page itself, the way you'd talk to yourself in an empty room when you needed to hear a voice, any voice, even your own. Why does the house feel different at night than during the day, when nothing about its physical structure changes? That was one entry, sitting alone on an otherwise blank page, no context before or after it, as though it had arrived in his mind fully formed and demanded to be written down immediately, exactly as it had occurred to him. And then, several pages later, underlined 3 times with a pressure heavy enough that I could feel the indentation on the page beneath it when I ran my thumb across the paper, was the line that has not left my mind since the night I first read it. They don't take you, you give yourself. I read it in my kitchen at nearly 1 in the morning, the dog finally mercifully gone quiet below me, and I felt the hair rise on my arms in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I want to tell you I dismissed it immediately, that my rational, my father's daughter mind reached for an explanation and found one, the way it always had before. I tried. I told myself he'd been under enormous stress, 6 disappearances, a town full of grieving families, a sheriff's department that had failed for a year to see what should have been obvious, all of it resting on the shoulders of a man who took every unsolved case personally, who used to lie awake at home some nights, I remembered now, staring at the ceiling in a way my mother called working a case in his sleep. Stress does strange things to people. It makes them philosophical in ways that read, later, out of context, as ominous. That was the explanation I built for myself that night, brick by careful brick, and I believed it well enough to finally close the notebook and go to bed. I didn't yet understand how wrong that comfort was. I didn't understand it for weeks. Not really. Not in my body. In the place where understanding actually changes how you move through the world, instead of just how you think about it. But something in me had already started keeping score, already started noticing, the way you notice a floorboard that creaks slightly differently than the one beside it, that my father, a man who spent his entire career finding the missing numbers, filling the gaps, resolving fear into fact, had, in his final entries, stopped trying to explain what he was experiencing at all. He'd simply started recording it. The way you record something you've already accepted you can't change. The way you record something you've already, on some level, agreed to. I went back through those early pages again, days later, hunting for something I might have missed the first time, and found a detail I'd skimmed past too quickly the first night. A small, almost throwaway line tucked into an otherwise ordinary interview summary, dated a full week before the handwriting began its slow contraction. He'd been speaking with an elderly man who lived 2 houses down from the property on Amity Row, a long-time resident who'd apparently lived on that street since childhood. My father had written, in his still normal, still expansive hand, "Witness declined to discuss the house directly. When pressed, said only that some things in this town know they're being looked at, and they don't love it. Witness would not elaborate further and asked, twice, that I not mention his name in connection with the property." I remember reading that line and feeling something cold settle low in my stomach, because it meant the town had known. Not just suspected, not just avoided out of superstition, the way small towns avoid all manner of things without quite being able to say why, but known, with a specificity that suggested lived experience rather than folklore. I started paying closer attention, on subsequent reads, to what my father chose not to write down as much as what he did. There were gaps in the notebook, not physical gaps, not torn pages, but temporal ones, days that simply weren't accounted for at all, jumping from one dated entry to another 3 or 4 days later, with no acknowledgement of the missing time in between. I cross-referenced those gaps against the mileage logs from his rental car, and found something that unsettled me more than almost anything else in those early pages. On each of those missing days, according to the car's own recorded mileage, he had driven somewhere and come back, a round trip of just under 2 miles each way, almost exactly the distance I would later calculate using an old paper map I found folded into the back of the file, between his motel and the house on Amity Row. He'd gone there, repeatedly, on days he chose not to document at all, as though some part of him understood that certain visits shouldn't be written down, shouldn't be made official, shouldn't exist anywhere except in the private, compressing handwriting of a man who was slowly teaching himself to say less and less on paper the more he actually did. I think about those undocumented days more than almost anything else in this whole account. I think about my father driving to that house alone, at night probably, given how the mileage logs never lined up with his interview schedule, standing outside a condemned Victorian on a quiet residential street with no backup, no report filed, nobody aware of where he actually was. I think about what he might have seen on those visits that never made it onto any page I've been able to find. And I think, with a kind of grief that has no clean edges to it, about the fact that whatever those visits cost him, in sleep, in nerve, in whatever quiet erosion eventually produced handwriting small enough to hide from the page itself, he never once asked for help, never called the sheriff's department for support, never, as far as I can tell from every record available to me, told a single living soul what he was actually doing on those nights. He carried it alone, the way I suspect he'd always carried the hardest parts of his work, right up until the moment there was no one left for him to carry it toward at all. The name kept appearing in his notes with an increasing, almost obsessive frequency, until it seemed to be the gravitational center around which everything else in his investigation had begun to orbit. Amity Row, a residential street on the older, quieter edge of Hollow Bend, lined, according to the maps he'd sketched by hand in the margins of the notebook, with a mix of well-kept homes and a handful of properties that had fallen into disrepair over decades of neglect. And at the center of that street, at an address he'd circled so many times the pen had eventually worn a small hole through the paper, was a house, an abandoned Victorian, condemned by the town decades before any of the 6 disappearances had begun, boarded up, tax delinquent, the kind of structure that exists in every small town as a piece of local folklore, the place teenagers dare each other to spend the night in, the place parents warn their children away from without ever quite explaining why, the place that everyone in town has a story about and no one can quite agree on the details. What my father discovered, methodically, patiently, the way he discovered everything, was that all 6 victims had a documented, verifiable connection to that house before they vanished. Not a rumor, not folklore, actual traceable connections. A delivery receipt placing one victim on Amity Row 2 days before she disappeared. A neighbor's testimony placing another walking toward the house at dusk on the evening he was last seen. A set of muddy footprints matching a 3rd victim's shoe size found on the porch of the condemned Victorian, photographed and catalogued by local police months before my father ever arrived to consult on the case, filed away and never connected to anything because, individually, none of it seemed to mean much of anything at all. It took an outsider, someone willing to look at 18 months of scattered, unremarkable data all at once instead of case by case, to see the shape underneath it. He wrote, in an entry dated maybe 2 weeks into his investigation, that the house watched him back during his initial walkthrough. I remember reading that phrase for the first time and actually laughing, a short, surprised sound, alone in my kitchen, because it read so unlike him. My father did not write things like that. He wrote things like structural integrity compromised, 2nd floor inaccessible without support, and no signs of recent habitation, though evidence suggests periodic entry. He did not write about houses watching him back. I dismissed it, that first time, as poetic exaggeration, maybe even as a small private joke, the kind of thing a tired man writes at the end of a long day to amuse himself, a flourish he never intended anyone else to read. Detectives get tired. They spend too many hours alone with a case and start to personify the things around them, the same way sailors personify the sea, the same way anyone who spends enough time with a mystery starts to feel, on some half-conscious level, that the mystery is looking back. But then I found the photographs. They were tucked into a separate envelope inside the box, unlabeled, the kind of thing that could easily have been overlooked entirely if I hadn't already been primed, by the notebook, to look for anything out of place. A series of exterior shots of the house on Amity Row, taken, based on the angle of the light in each frame, across several different visits, several different times of day. The house itself, in every image, looked exactly as you'd expect a condemned Victorian to look, peeling paint the colour of old bone, windows either boarded over or simply dark, a porch sagging under its own accumulated weight, a yard gone wild with weeds that had grown up through the cracks in a stone walkway nobody had maintained in years. But in every single photograph, and I want to be precise here because I check this more times than I can count, holding each image up to a lamp, then to daylight, then finally scanning them into my computer and zooming in until the pixels themselves began to blur into meaningless static. There was a shape behind the glass of one particular 2nd floor window, the same window every time, regardless of which angle the photo had been taken from, regardless of the time of day. Not clear enough to identify as a person. I want to be honest about that, because I don't want to claim more certainty than the evidence actually supports. My father raised me better than that. It could have been a trick of the light on old, warped glass. It could have been a reflection of something outside the frame, a cloud, a bird, some ordinary object caught at an unlucky angle. It could have been nothing at all. a pattern my grief-hungry brain was imposing on random noise, the way people see faces in wood grain or clouds shaped like animals. But it was consistent. Across every photograph, taken on different days, at different times, in different light, the shape occupied the same position, behind that same window. And in the final photograph in the sequence, the one dated, based on his notes, only 4 days before his disappearance, the shape had moved. Not dramatically, just enough. Just enough that it was no longer centered in the window, the way it had been in every prior image, but shifted slightly toward the glass, closer, as though whatever it was had taken a single step forward between one visit and the next. Clear enough that I couldn't call it nothing. Clear enough that I sat at my kitchen table with that photograph in my hands for the better part of an hour, unable to look away and unable to keep looking, caught in that particular kind of paralysis that only genuine fear produces. Not the manufactured fear of a movie or a story, but the real thing, the kind that makes your body understand something before your mind is willing to admit it. I spent the following days doing what I imagine anyone in my position would do, which is to say I researched the house's history with a thoroughness that surprised even me, pulling county records, old newspaper archives, anything that might explain why a single residential property had accumulated this much unspoken dread over the decades. What I found was frustratingly thin, the way real history so often is compared to the tidy narratives we want it to have. The house had been built in the 1890s by a family named Halloway, prosperous enough in their day to afford the kind of ornate Victorian detailing that had long since rotted away, the gingerbread trim, the wraparound porch, all of it visible only in a handful of grainy photographs archived at the County Historical Society. The Halloway family had left Hollow Bend sometime in the 1930s. According to property records, the house passing through a series of owners over the following decades, none of whom, as far as I could determine, stayed longer than a year or two before selling, often at a loss, often without any explanation on record beyond vague references to personal circumstances. The town condemned it formally in the 1970s, citing structural concerns, though the inspection report I eventually tracked down through a records request read strangely for a document meant to be purely technical. Several passages noting unexplained temperature variance between floors and occupant reports inconsistent with structural assessment, language that felt, even filtered through decades of bureaucratic distance, like someone trying very hard to describe something they didn't have adequate vocabulary for. I found no record of anyone dying inside the house, no grisly local legend with a name and a date attached to it, the way these stories usually accumulate one. Just a slow, patient reputation, built up generation after generation, of a place that people simply learned, without ever being formally told, to leave alone. What struck me most, working through all of this in the weeks after finding the photographs, was how little any of it actually explained. My father hadn't stumbled onto some forgotten tragedy that, once uncovered, would resolve neatly into cause and effect. He'd found a pattern of behavior, grief, then proximity, then disappearance, that seemed to operate entirely independent of any single historical event, as though the house itself, or whatever occupied it, wasn't reacting to something that had happened there once, but simply doing what it had always done, patiently, across more than a century, largely unnoticed because it never took enough people at once, in any single stretch of years, to register as anything other than the ordinary sad attrition of small-town life. It had taken my father's specific gift, his ability to see a shape spread across 18 months and 6 unrelated lives, to finally notice a hunger that had been operating, undisturbed, for far longer than any of us could easily comprehend. I asked my mother about Hollow Bend exactly once, years before the box ever arrived, back when my father had only been gone a handful of months, and the whole family was still operating under the pretense, a pretense we all silently agreed to maintain, the way families do, that he might still turn up. that there might still be an explanation, mundane or otherwise, that would bring him walking back through the front door with some story about amnesia, about a head injury, about anything at all that wasn't the alternative none of us could say out loud. I asked her, over dinner, in the careful, tentative tone you use when you already sense you're approaching something dangerous, what she knew about the town where he'd disappeared, whether he'd mentioned anything strange in his phone calls home, whether anything about the case had worried her before he left. She left the room without answering, not angrily, not with the kind of dramatic exit you'd see in a film, a door slammed, a chair knocked back. She simply stood, carried her plate to the sink, rinsed it with a care that felt deliberate, unhurried, almost performed, and walked upstairs. She didn't come back down that night. I remember sitting alone at the table, my own dinner going cold in front of me, feeling for the first time a specific, distinct kind of fear that had nothing to do with my father's disappearance itself, and everything to do with the shape of my mother's silence around it. It felt less like grief and more like restraint, like a woman holding something back with both hands, bracing against a door she was terrified would open if she let go for even a moment. She has never spoken his name since the funeral we held without a body, a small, quiet service, closed casket in the sense that there was no casket at all, just a framed photograph on a stand, and a room full of people who didn't quite know what they were mourning, an absence rather than a death, a question mark instead of a period. I used to attribute her silence entirely to grief. It seemed like the obvious explanation, the kind my father himself would have reached for, the simplest hypothesis that fit the available facts. Grief takes people differently. Some people talk endlessly about the person they've lost, keeping them present through sheer repetition of their name. Others go the opposite direction, seal the loss away somewhere private, protect themselves by refusing to disturb it. I told myself my mother was the second kind. I told myself that for 3 years. But reading through the notebook, deep in the pages where his handwriting had already begun its slow contraction into something smaller and tighter, I found an entry that changed the shape of everything I'd assumed about her silence. It wasn't addressed to the case file, it wasn't procedural, wasn't dated with the careful precision of his other entries. It was a letter, or the start of one, written directly to her, and it had never been sent. I know this because my mother has never once, in 3 years, mentioned receiving any final communication from him. And if she had received something like this, I don't believe she could have kept it from me. Not entirely, not with a silence this specific. Elaine, it began, using her name the way he only did when something was serious, when the moment called for the full weight of formality, instead of the nicknames and shorthand of 20 years of marriage. If you're reading this and I'm gone, I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually listen, instead of doing what you always do, which is already deciding you know what I'm going to say before I say it. Don't come looking, please, for once in your life, don't come looking. I know you. I know exactly what you'll want to do, and I am asking you, as clearly and as seriously as I have ever asked you anything in 22 years, to fight that instinct with everything you have. Whatever you find here, whatever explanation you build for yourself about what happened to me, let it be enough. Don't chase the parts that don't add up. Some mysteries aren't puzzles, some of them are doors, and the only thing on the other side is more door. I sat with that entry for a very long time, the notebook open on my lap, my apartment silent around me, in a way that suddenly felt less like peace and more like held breath. It wasn't grief I saw in my mother's silence anymore, replayed now in my memory with this new context laid over it like a transparency sheet, revealing a hidden image beneath a familiar one. It was fear, specific, targeted, informed fear. The fear of a woman who had perhaps received some version of this warning herself, in a phone call, in a look he gave her before he left for that final consult. in some private conversation between the two of them that I, as their child, had never been privy to and never would be now. My mother wasn't protecting herself from grief by staying silent. I understood that now, with a certainty that settled into my stomach like a stone. She was protecting me, and I had just spent an entire evening undoing every bit of that protection, one page at a time, without her permission, without her knowledge, driven by the exact instinct my father had begged her, in writing, to resist on my behalf. I thought back, that night, to the weeks immediately following his disappearance, trying to remember details I hadn't understood the significance of at the time. My mother had insisted, against the advice of nearly everyone in our extended family, that we not hire a private investigator to supplement the official search. I remembered arguing with her about it, 19 years old and furious in the specific, helpless way grief makes you furious at the people closest to you, accusing her of giving up on him too easily, of not fighting hard enough to bring him home. She'd taken that accusation without defending herself, without raising her voice, simply absorbing it the way you absorb weather, and I had never understood, until reading that letter years later, that she hadn't been giving up on him at all. She'd been trying, with everything she had, to keep the rest of us from becoming the next names on a list none of us knew existed yet. I also remembered, with a clarity that unsettled me more the longer I sat with it, a single strange detail from the week after he vanished. My mother, standing in our kitchen at 2 a.m, boxing up every photograph in the house that included Amity Rowe's address on the back, every printed map, every scrap of paper connected to Hollow Bend that had come home with him from prior visits, sealing them all into a box she then drove somewhere and never spoke of again. I'd assumed at 19 that it was simply too painful for her to keep those reminders in the house. I understand now that she was doing something closer to triage, cutting off every visible thread that might, someday, lead one of us back toward that town, that street, that house. She hadn't succeeded, obviously. The department had kept its own copies, sealed in evidence, waiting 3 years to be released to me, regardless of anything she'd tried to bury. But I understood, finally, sitting with her unsent letter in my lap, that her silence had never been an absence of love. It had been the clearest expression of it she had left available to her, and I had spent 3 years mistaking it for something cold. I thought, too, about the years since, about every small moment I'd taken for evidence of her simply moving on, of grief softening with time the way grief is supposed to, according to every book and every well-meaning friend who'd ever tried to comfort me. She'd started dating again, briefly, about a year after he vanished, a kind, unremarkable man from her book club who I'd liked well enough, and I remembered feeling, at the time, a confusing mixture of relief and betrayal on my father's behalf, as though her willingness to move forward at all was a kind of quiet admission that she'd given up on him. I understand now that I had it backward. She wasn't giving up on him. She was trying, in the only way she knew how, to keep herself anchored to an ordinary life, to build enough weight into her present that she wouldn't be pulled, the way he had been pulled, the way I would eventually be pulled, toward whatever gravity still operated in a town 4 hours from our home. I have wondered, more than once since reading that letter, whether my mother suspected something even before he left for that final consult, whether there had been a conversation between them, private, unrecorded, in which he'd told her more than he ever wrote down in his official notes, some earlier case perhaps, some earlier warning passed down through his years in law enforcement about towns like Hollow Bend, houses like the one on Amity Rowe, patterns that experienced investigators learn, eventually, to recognize and steer around. I don't know. I may never know. But I've come to believe that my mother's silence was never simple, was never just the ordinary quiet of a grieving widow. It was the silence of someone who understood, far better than I ever gave her credit for, exactly what kind of danger she was trying to keep her only child away from. I want to tell you that I stopped there, that I read my father's letter to my mother, understood the warning embedded in it, and had the good sense to close the notebook and never open it again. I did not do that. I have never claimed to be a wiser person than my father, and if anything, the months that followed proved I had inherited the very trait in him that got him killed, or taken, or whatever the correct word is for what actually happened to him, the trait that made him incapable of leaving a mystery unfinished, even when every available signal was screaming at him to walk away. Instead, I did what he had done. I mapped the 6 victims myself, the way he'd taught me to map things when I was younger, back when he used to bring cold case files home, sanitized, names redacted, more of a teaching exercise than actual work, and have me lay them out across our kitchen table like puzzle pieces, looking for the shape underneath the noise. I printed everything from the box, photographs, interview summaries, the scattered, fragmented notes from his own investigation. I laid it all out across my own kitchen table, in my own apartment, 300 miles and 3 years removed from wherever he'd actually done this same work, and I looked for the pattern the way he'd taught me to look. All 6 victims were, on the surface, strangers to one another, different ages, ranging from a woman in her early 20s to a retired schoolteacher well into his 70s, different neighborhoods, different occupations, different social circles that, according to the sheriff's department's exhaustive but ultimately fruitless canvassing, never intersected in any documented way. That was, I think, exactly why it took so long for anyone to see them as connected at all. There was no obvious thread, no shared workplace, no mutual friend, no overlapping social event that could explain how 6 unrelated people in a small town had all managed to vanish within 18 months of one another, except for one thread buried deep enough in the case files that it took my father, and then, following his exact methodology, took me considerable time to isolate it from the noise around it. Each of the 6 victims had recently lost someone close to them before they disappeared. Not distantly, not in some vague, statistically inevitable way that you could argue applies to nearly everyone eventually. Recently, and specifically, in the weeks or months immediately preceding their own vanishing, a husband, dead of a sudden heart attack 4 months before his wife disappeared, a daughter, lost to a car accident on the interstate, her mother gone without a trace within 90 days of the funeral, a twin brother, drowned in a boating accident the summer before his sister walked out of her apartment one evening and never came home. My father had written, in an entry near the end of the notebook, in handwriting so compressed and tight it had taken me several attempts to fully decipher it. The house doesn't take the living, it takes the grieving. I stared at that sentence for what felt like an unreasonably long time, long enough that the words themselves began to lose their meaning, the way any phrase does when you look at it too closely for too long, dissolving into shapes and sounds instead of information. And then, all at once, the meaning came rushing back, heavier than it had been before, because I finally understood, with the specific, cold clarity that only true realization brings, the kind that arrives in your body before your mind has finished processing it, that I fit the pattern he had just described. 3 years ago, I lost my father. I sat in my apartment at 1 a.m, surrounded by printed photographs of 6 strangers' faces, all of them people who had lost someone, and then, within a defined window afterward, vanished from a house on a street I had never visited, in a town I had only ever read about second-hand, in a dead man's handwriting, and I was holding, in my own 2 hands, the one object of his, that the house, if it even was the house, if my rational mind could even accept that framing, had somehow allowed to leave, had somehow let go of. I remember the specific, uncomfortable thought that arrived in my mind at that moment, unbidden, unwelcome, and impossible to dismiss once it had fully formed. What if it wasn't let go? What if it was sent? I spent the next several days trying to disprove my own theory, because that's what my father would have done, what he'd trained me to do since childhood. Treat your favorite hypothesis with more suspicion than any other, because the mind is always eager to confirm what it already believes, and eager, cruel, to reward the conclusion that lets it stop looking. I went looking for a seventh victim who didn't fit the pattern, hoping to find the exception that would collapse the whole theory back into coincidence. I couldn't find one. Every single case, when I dug deep enough into local records, obituaries, the kind of small-town newspaper archives that only exist in half-digitized municipal databases, revealed the same underlying thread once I knew to look for it. Grief, recent and specific, always preceding the disappearance by a matter of months, sometimes only weeks. I noticed something else too, something my father's notes hadn't fully articulated, but that emerged clearly once I laid all 6 timelines side by side. The window between loss and disappearance seemed to be narrowing across the 18-month period. The earliest victim had lost her husband nearly 6 months before she vanished. The most recent, the retired schoolteacher, had lost his wife of 40 years only 5 weeks before he was last seen. Whatever process governed this pattern seemed to be accelerating, growing hungrier, requiring less time between a person's grief taking root and their eventual vanishing, as though something was learning, refining its own method, becoming more efficient at recognizing and claiming the specific kind of hollowed-out vulnerability that fresh loss creates in a person. I sat with that acceleration for a long time, turning it over the way my father had taught me to turn over any troubling piece of evidence, looking for what it implied rather than just what it stated. If the pattern was accelerating before he ever arrived to investigate it, and if it had already claimed a 7th victim in the months after his own disappearance, a fact I hadn't yet uncovered at that point in my research, though I would find it soon enough, then whatever timeline governed this hunger hadn't stopped, hadn't paused out of any respect for the fact that its most recent target had been a trained investigator rather than an ordinary grieving townsperson. It had simply continued, patient and mechanical, exactly as my father's letter to my mother had implied it would. I was not looking at a closed case. I understood that now with total, uncomfortable clarity. I was looking at an ongoing one, still running, still counting down toward whoever fit its criteria next. And I had just spent an entire evening confirming, methodically, in my own handwriting this time instead of his, that I fit it perfectly. I remember getting up from the kitchen table around 3 in the morning, unable to sit with the photographs any longer, and standing at my window looking out at the quiet street below, trying to locate some ordinary anchor to pull myself back from the specific vertigo of what I'd just concluded. The street looked exactly as it always did. A parked delivery van, a streetlight flickering slightly at its base. The same unremarkable urban quiet I'd lived inside for 2 years without ever once feeling watched by it. And yet I found myself, standing there, running through the same mental exercise my father must have run through in his final weeks, cataloguing my own grief, measuring its depth and its recency, trying to determine, with a detective's cold precision, exactly how vulnerable I currently was to whatever criteria this pattern operated on. I concluded that night that I didn't know. 3 years felt like a long time. Long enough, I hoped, to have moved beyond whatever acute window made a person susceptible to this kind of predation. But the 7th victim's case complicated that hope considerably. She hadn't lost anyone recently at all, as far as I could determine, and had still been claimed, apparently, simply for the crime of getting too close to the truth, of caring too much about an unsolved mystery involving a man she'd never even met. That detail unsettled me more than almost anything else in the 6-victim pattern, because it suggested the house's criteria might not be limited strictly to fresh grief. It suggested that curiosity itself, pursued far enough, insistently enough, might function as its own kind of qualifying wound. I sat with that possibility for a long time, before finally forcing myself to bed. unable to shake the growing suspicion that by that point, simply through the act of research I'd already conducted, I might have already qualified myself twice over. I found the cassette almost by accident, tucked into a slim pocket, sewn into the inside back cover of the notebook. A detail of the leather's construction I hadn't noticed until I ran my fingers along the seam late one night, looking for anything I might have missed on my first several passes through the material. Unlabeled. No case number, no date, nothing written on the plastic casing at all, which struck me immediately as strange, because my father labeled everything. It was, I would come to understand, perhaps the most deliberate omission in the entire notebook, a piece of evidence he had chosen, consciously, not to formally catalogue, not to connect on paper to anything else in his investigation, as though even naming it might have been a risk he wasn't willing to take. I don't own a cassette player anymore. Almost no one does. I drove out to my aunt's house on a Saturday, claiming, with a lie that felt uncomfortably natural coming out of my mouth, that I'd found some old family tapes I wanted to digitize before they degraded further. Home movies. Nothing important. Nothing she needed to worry about. She has an ancient stereo system in her garage, inherited from my grandfather, that still, miraculously, has a working tape deck. I sat on an overturned bucket in that garage, the cassette loaded, my aunt occupied elsewhere in the house, and pressed play with a feeling in my chest I can only describe as the specific dread of someone about to hear a voice they've been missing for 3 years. It was him, my father's voice, unmistakable, calm, and entirely professional in the exact register he used for witness interviews. A tone I remembered from childhood, from the rare occasions he'd let me sit in on a practice interview, patient, measured, designed to put people at ease. He was interviewing someone. The other voice on the tape never registered clearly, not even once across the full runtime, as though it had been recorded through water or through several layers of some material that dampened and distorted it just enough to make identification impossible. Not a language I didn't recognize, not static, but something in between, a voice that seemed to resist the tape's ability to capture it at all. Most of what the second voice said was lost entirely to that distortion, but there was one phrase, near the middle of the recording, that came through with unsettling, almost deliberate clarity, as though whoever, or whatever, was speaking had wanted this particular sentence understood. He'll send his own, eventually. They always send their own. My father's voice, immediately after, sounds different. I've listened to that transition more times than I can count, trying to identify exactly what changes, and the closest I can come to describing it is that it sounds smaller. The same measured, professional cadence, but thinner somehow, stretched over something underneath it that hadn't been there a moment before. He says, quietly, almost too quietly for the recording to catch it at all, "I have a daughter." The voice responds. One word, "Good." The tape continues for another several minutes after that, but the content grows increasingly difficult to make out, my father's voice fading in and out of clarity, the way a radio signal does when you're driving out of range of a station, until finally there's a long stretch of silence, followed by what sounds like the click of the recorder being manually stopped. I sat in my aunt's garage for a long time after the tape ended, the machine's small red lights still glowing, the silence around me suddenly enormous, and I understood, with a certainty I couldn't argue myself out of, no matter how hard I tried in the days that followed, that I had just listened to the exact moment my father learned that whatever was happening in Hollow Bend wasn't going to stay contained to him, that it had already, in some way he clearly understood far better than I did, started looking past him toward me. I rewound the tape and listened to it a second time, and then a third, each pass revealing small new details I'd missed before, a faint sound in the background, somewhere around the 2-minute mark, that I eventually identified as the specific creak of old floorboards under weight, though whose weight I couldn't say. since my father's own voice never wavered in position or distance from the recorder throughout the entire interview. On the fourth listen, I noticed something I'd entirely missed the first 3 times. A brief moment, just before the phrase "about sending its own," where my father's breathing changes, becomes audibly shallower, faster, the sound of a man trying very hard to keep his voice steady, while something in his body had already begun reacting to a threat his training hadn't prepared him for. He never let it show in his words, only in that one unguarded breath, caught by a machine that was never meant to notice it. 3 years before I sat in a garage, on an overturned bucket, and finally heard what he'd been hiding. I sat with the tape in my lap afterward, my aunt's garage growing cold around me as the afternoon light shifted, and tried to imagine the room he must have been sitting in when this recording was made. Not the house on Amity Row itself, I didn't think. The acoustics were wrong for that. Too tight, too close, more like a small enclosed space than the sprawling, impossible hallway I would encounter myself, months later, somewhere smaller. A motel room maybe? Or an office at the sheriff's station. Some space he considered safe enough to conduct an interview in, not realizing, or perhaps already suspecting and choosing to proceed anyway, that safety was never something distance alone could guarantee against whatever he'd been speaking with. I thought about the courage that must have taken, sitting across from something that couldn't be clearly heard, couldn't be clearly seen if there had been a camera at all, and continuing to ask it questions in the same calm, professional register he used on every ordinary witness, because that was the only tool he had, and he used it anyway, right up until the moment the only card he had left to play was the truth about me. I have never been able to identify who or what he was interviewing on that tape. I've turned the mystery over from every angle I can think of, cross-referencing it against every name in the case file, every witness he'd spoken with, according to his written notes, and none of them matched the timeline, the tone, the specific wrongness of that second voice. Whatever it was, it existed outside the official record entirely, unlogged, uncatalogued, deliberately kept separate from everything else he'd built during his investigation. The one interview, out of dozens, that he clearly understood could never be filed, never be explained to a superior, never be treated as ordinary evidence, because whatever he'd been speaking with on that tape wasn't the kind of witness the law had any framework for at all. Sleep did not come easily that night, or for many nights afterward. I lay in bed with the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, the same phrase circling my thoughts with the same patient, mechanical rhythm. He'll send his own, eventually. They always send their own. I turned the sentence over from every angle I could think of, the way my father had taught me to examine evidence, looking for the reading that made the least sense, then working backward from there. Was it a threat, spoken by whatever had taken him, promising some future obligation he would eventually be forced to fulfill? Or was it something closer to a prophecy, a description of a pattern so consistent, so reliable, that it had simply been stated as fact, the way you might describe the sun rising each morning, not as a threat, but as an observation about how the world reliably works? I looked up Hollow Bend's more recent history, searching local news archives and public records with the same dogged persistence my father had brought to his own investigation, and found something he had never gotten the chance to write down, something that must have happened after whatever final entry closed out his notebook. A 7th disappearance. 4 months after his own, a young woman, 26 years old according to the sparse local coverage, new to Hollow Bend, having moved there only months before, for reasons the article never fully explained. No documented connection to any of the original 6 victims, no obvious grief in her recent history that I could find, no lost husband or daughter or twin brother to fit the pattern my father had identified. Except for one detail, buried in a follow-up article published nearly a year after her disappearance, the kind of small local piece that exists mostly to note that a case remains unsolved, that investigators have exhausted their leads, that anyone with information is asked to come forward. The article mentioned, almost in passing, that in the weeks before she vanished, the young woman had been asking questions around town about a missing detective, about my father, though the article never used his name directly, referring to him only as the out-of-town investigator who disappeared while working the case the previous year. She'd been trying to finish what he started. I sat with my laptop open on my kitchen table, that small local article glowing on the screen in front of me, and felt something shift in my understanding of the entire situation, a recalibration that changed not just what I believed had happened, but what I now understood might still be happening, actively, in the present tense, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. This wasn't a closed case. This wasn't a tragedy that had occurred and then, mercifully, stopped. Whatever pattern my father had identified, grief, followed by disappearance, followed by silence, had continued without him, had, in fact, claimed someone who had specifically gone looking for answers about him, as though the house, or whatever intelligence directed it, had recognized her curiosity as its own kind of grief, its own kind of qualifying loss, and responded to it accordingly. She never got the chance either. That was the final line of the article, stated with the flat, unremarkable finality of local journalism, describing a case gone cold, and it landed in my chest with a weight entirely disproportionate to its brevity. I understood, reading it, that I was no longer simply researching my father's disappearance as a closed historical event I was trying to make peace with. I was researching something ongoing, something that had continued to claim people in the years since he vanished, that showed no sign of stopping, that had, if the pattern held, been waiting this entire time, patient in a way that felt almost geological, almost indifferent to the specific span of a single human life, for someone else who fit its particular criteria to come looking. I fit the criteria. I had fit it for 3 years, ever since the funeral we held without a body, and I had simply never allowed myself to draw the line all the way from my own grief to the pattern my father had died, or vanished, or whatever the correct word was, trying to understand. I closed my laptop that night with my hands trembling, and I told myself, with a conviction I almost believed, that I would stop here, that I would return the notebook to the box, seal it again, put it somewhere I'd never have to look at it, and let my father's warning to my mother finally do the job it was always meant to do. I believed that conviction for almost exactly 1 week. I spent that week trying, with genuine effort, to live an ordinary life around the shape of what I now knew. I went to work. I forced myself through the motions of my freelance projects, delivering invoices, answering client emails, performing a version of normalcy that felt, increasingly, like an act I was putting on for an audience of one. I called my mother again, and this time, though I still didn't tell her about the notebook, I found myself asking, carefully, obliquely, whether she'd ever considered that grief itself might be dangerous in ways beyond the obvious, whether she believed a person could be, in some sense, more vulnerable after a loss than before it. She'd gone quiet on the line for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice had a strange, careful weight to it that I didn't fully understand until much later. I think, she'd said, that grief makes people willing to go places they'd never go otherwise. I think that's the most dangerous thing about it. I hadn't pressed her further. I wish now that I had. I found the 7th victim's family during that week too, or what remained of them, a younger sister, living 2 states away, who had set up a small memorial page online in the months after the disappearance. The kind of digital shrine people build when there's no grave to visit, no funeral to hold, nothing but an absence that needs somewhere to be witnessed. I read through every post on that page, every comment left by friends and family members trying to process a loss with no ending attached to it, and found, buried in an early entry, a detail that struck me with particular force. The sister had written that her missing sibling had always been the fixer of their family, the one who couldn't leave a problem unsolved, who'd once driven 6 hours in bad weather just to help a friend move apartments because she'd said no one else would follow through. She had gone to Hollow Bend, according to that same post, specifically because she'd heard about the detective who vanished there and felt, in the sister's words, like someone needed to finish what he couldn't. I read that line more times than I probably should have, sitting alone in my apartment with the week I'd promised myself already beginning to unravel, because I recognized that description. I recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection in an unexpected window. The fixer, the one who couldn't leave a problem unsolved, the one who would drive toward danger rather than let a mystery sit unfinished. I had spent my whole life believing that trait was something my father had given me on purpose, a gift, an inheritance I was proud to carry forward. Reading about a stranger who shared it, who had died for it, or vanished for it, in the exact same town, chasing the exact same unanswered question, I began to understand it differently, not as a gift, as a vulnerability with a very specific shape, one that something patient and hungry in Hollow Bend had learned, over generations, exactly how to recognize and exploit. I told myself, as I packed a bag on a Thursday evening, that I had somehow, without quite noticing the decision being made, already committed myself to, that I was going for research, for closure, for the article I'd started telling people I was writing, a freelance piece about a cold case, about a father's unfinished work, something that would let me frame this entire descent as professional curiosity rather than what it actually was. All lies. I understood they were lies even as I told them to myself, packing a single overnight bag with the specific efficiency of someone who doesn't actually expect to need more than one night's worth of clothes, though I couldn't have told you at the time whether that was optimism or something closer to resignation. I was going because something in that notebook had reached out of the page sometime over the preceding weeks and pulled a hook through my ribs that I couldn't work free no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. I understood, driving out of my apartment complex in the grey early light of a Friday morning, that I was doing exactly what my father had begged my mother, in writing, not to let me do. I understood it, and I did it anyway, because I am his daughter in every way that matters, including the ways that got him killed. The drive took just over 4 hours, most of it along increasingly rural highways that shed traffic and civilization in equal measure the further I got from home, until the last hour or so felt like driving into a version of the country that had simply been left behind by time. Gas stations with hand-painted signs, towns whose entire commercial districts consisted of a single intersection. Route 9, when I finally reached it, was exactly as photographed in my father's file. Flat, grey, stretching toward a horizon that never quite seemed to arrive, edged on both sides by cornfields that had long since gone dead and brown, stalks standing at odd angles like something had walked through them without bothering to follow any of the planted rows. My phone lost signal 11 miles out from Hollow Bend, according to the last mile marker I passed, before the bars on my screen dropped from 1 to none and simply stayed there, refusing to return, no matter how many times I glanced down at it over the remaining distance, as though checking obsessively might somehow will the connection back into existence. I remember thinking, with a calm that surprised me specifically because I would have expected panic, and instead felt something closer to a strange, settled inevitability, that my father must have felt this exact same tightening in his chest on this exact same stretch of road, driving toward the same silence I was now driving into. I kept driving anyway, of course I did. So had he. I stopped once, about 8 miles outside town, at a gas station that looked like it had been built sometime in the 70s and never updated since. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a way that felt aggressive against the surrounding quiet. The attendant, An older man, with the specific weathered look of someone who'd spent his whole life within a 20-mile radius, glanced at my card, glanced at the address I'd typed into the receipt printer's directions request out of habit, and went very still for a moment before handing everything back to me without a word. I asked him, almost against my own better judgment, whether he knew Amity Row. He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that measures a person and finds them wanting in some way they can't quite name, and said only, "That street doesn't get many visitors anymore. Folks around here learned a while back to just let it be." I asked what he meant. He didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the door, a gesture that felt less like dismissal and more like the closing of a subject he had no intention of reopening, and I drove the rest of the way in a silence that felt heavier for having been confirmed by someone who actually lived there. I thought, during those final miles, about all the ordinary reasons a person doesn't do what I was doing. I thought about my job, my apartment, the small, unremarkable life I'd built in the 3 years since the funeral we held without a body. A life made of routines and small pleasures, coffee in the mornings, a running group I'd joined and then quietly stopped attending, friendships I maintained with the specific, careful effort of someone who understood, on some level, that connection required upkeep she wasn't always sure she had the energy for. I thought about how easily all of it could simply continue without me, the terrible, humbling realization that arrives, I think, for everyone eventually, that the world does not actually need any one of us as much as we'd like to believe. I thought about my mother, and the letter my father had written her, and the specific cruelty of what I was about to do to a woman who had already lost one member of her family to this exact stretch of road, this exact patient hunger. And then I thought about him, about my father, sitting somewhere in this same darkening landscape 3 years earlier, understanding, with a detective's clarity, exactly what he was driving toward, and choosing, anyway, to keep going. I understood, in that moment, that I had never really had a choice at all, not one that mattered. Not once I'd opened that box. The town's welcome sign appeared just as the light was starting to fail properly. A modest hand-painted board announcing Hollow Bend, population figures that hadn't been updated in what looked like decades, the numbers themselves partially obscured by weather and time. I slowed instinctively as I passed it, the way you slow entering any small town, though I understood, even as I did it, that the gesture was less about respecting a speed limit and more about some deeper reluctance to arrive, a final small delay before whatever came next became unavoidable. The main street, when it appeared, was quieter than I expected for what should still have been early evening. A hardware store with its lights already off, a diner with a handful of cars parked outside, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the deepening dark, a scene of such ordinary small-town normalcy that it felt, for a moment, almost reassuring, as though I'd simply driven into an unremarkable place that happened to share a name with the town in my father's case file. That reassurance didn't last. As I drove further, following the directions I'd memorized so thoroughly I no longer needed to check them, the ordinary texture of the town began to thin, the way a signal weakens the further you travel from its source. Streetlights grew sparser, houses grew darker, fewer of them showing any sign of occupancy at all despite the early hour, curtains drawn, driveways empty, a pervasive stillness that felt less like the natural quiet of a sleepy town and more like the specific, deliberate stillness of a place holding its breath. I remember thinking, somewhere around that point, that my father must have made this exact same drive, watched this exact same transition from ordinary to uncanny unfold outside his own windshield, and I found myself, absurdly, wishing I could reach back through 3 years of silence and warn him, knowing, even as the thought formed, that it wouldn't have mattered, that he already knew, that knowing had never been the thing that could have saved him. I found the address without much difficulty. The town itself, small enough that its layout revealed itself within the first 10 minutes of driving through it. A modest downtown, a handful of churches, residential streets branching off in orderly grids that gradually grew less orderly and more overgrown the further they extended toward the town's edges. Amity Row sat at exactly that kind of edge, the pavement cracked and patched in a way that suggested the town's maintenance budget simply gave out somewhere around this particular block, the houses growing sparser and more weathered the closer I got to the address I'd memorized from my father's notes. The house itself, when I finally parked across the street and simply sat in my car looking at it, was smaller than the photographs had suggested. I want to note that specifically because I'd expected, somehow, based on everything I'd read and felt about this place over the preceding weeks, something looming, something architecturally imposing in the way that certain old houses genuinely are. This was not that. It was a modest Victorian, 2 stories, its footprint no larger than any of the surrounding homes. And somehow, that smallness made everything worse. The way a quiet room can feel more threatening than a loud one, the way a soft voice can carry more menace than a shout. It felt like it had been waiting, I thought, sitting in my car with the engine still running, folding itself down deliberately into something more intimate, more personal, more suited to whatever singular purpose it existed to serve. I stood at the gate as the sun dropped, and it dropped fast. Faster, I was almost certain, than it should have, the light draining from the sky with a speed that felt less like the natural rotation of the earth and more like something being switched off. The windows were dark, every one of them, boards long since removed or rotted away, leaving the glass exposed and black, reflecting nothing of the fading light around it. But I felt watched. I felt it the exact way my father had described in his notes, a pressure building behind my sternum, like eyes pressing outward from somewhere inside my own skull, rather than looking in at me from somewhere outside my body, an inversion of the usual direction of being observed that I still don't have adequate language for, 3 years and countless retellings later. I raised my phone out of some automatic, unthinking habit, the reflex of a generation that photographs everything without quite deciding to, and in the frame, in the second-floor window, my father's own photographs had circled and recircled until the pen wore through the paper. There was a shape. It was smiling. I lowered the phone slowly, my hand steadier than I expected it to be, and looked up at the actual window instead of the screen. Some instinct telling me that whatever I'd captured might not be visible to my naked eye at all, might exist only in whatever strange, mediated space a camera occupies between reality and representation. But it was there, unmistakably there, a pale shape pressed close against the glass, features indistinct in the deepening dark, but unmistakably arranged in an expression I could only describe as a smile, wide and patient, and entirely wrong in its proportions, stretched slightly too far across whatever face contained it. I stood on that cracked sidewalk for what felt like a very long time, my breath fogging faintly in the cooling air, unable to make myself look away, and unable, despite every rational impulse screaming at me to do so, to make myself turn and walk back to my car. I thought, standing there, about the 6 victims whose photographs I'd spread across my kitchen table weeks earlier, about the 7th victim who'd come here specifically looking for answers about my father himself, standing perhaps in this exact spot years before me, looking up at this exact same window. I wondered whether he had seen the same shape I was seeing now, whether it had smiled at him too, whether that smile had been the last thing he registered before whatever came next. I found myself doing something I hadn't expected, speaking aloud, into the empty street, my voice sounding strange and small against the vastness of the darkening sky. "I know you took him," I said, to the window, to the shape behind it, to whatever intelligence organized itself around this house, and had been patient enough to wait 3 years for someone who fit its criteria to finally arrive on its doorstep. "I'm not leaving until I know what happened." The shape in the window did not move. It did not need to. I understood, even as the words left my mouth, that I had just done exactly what it had been waiting for, announced myself, declared my intention, confirmed, out loud, in a voice it could presumably hear, with whatever senses a thing like that possessed, that I belonged to the specific category of person it had spent generations learning to recognize and claim. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a smell I hadn't noticed before, something like wet earth and old paper, and somewhere behind me, back toward the edge of town, I heard what might have been a dog barking, once, and then falling silent in a way that felt less like the animal losing interest, and more like something had made it stop. I noticed, standing there, small details about the property that I hadn't fully registered in my father's photographs. A child's bicycle, rusted through and half swallowed by the overgrown grass near the porch steps, its wheels long since seized, a detail that unsettled me more than almost anything else about the house's exterior, because it implied a history of ordinary domestic life that had somehow been abandoned mid-motion, a bicycle simply left where it fell and never retrieved. I noticed a wind chime hanging motionless from the porch overhang despite the breeze that had just picked up around me, its metal tubes tarnished to a dull green, utterly still, in a way that felt wrong given the air actively moving through the yard around it, as though the porch itself existed in some slightly different atmosphere than the rest of the property, sealed off, undisturbed by whatever weather touched everything around it. I thought about turning back then. I want to be honest that the thought occurred to me, clearly and completely, standing at that gate, with the smiling shape still visible behind the glass above me. A full, coherent thought, not just a flicker of instinct, but an actual, considered option I held in my mind for several long seconds. I could get back in my car. I could drive the 4 hours home, could return the notebook and the photographs to their box, could seal it all away, the way my mother had tried to seal it away 3 years earlier, and simply let this remain, forever, an unsolved mystery, a wound I learned to live around rather than into. I thought about that option with real, genuine seriousness, weighing it the way my father had taught me to weigh any decision, examining its consequences from every angle I could manage. And then I thought about the 7th victim, about her sister's memorial page, about the specific loneliness of dying in pursuit of an answer nobody else was brave enough or reckless enough to keep chasing. I thought about my father's own notebook, filed under a name that wasn't his, evidence gathered and preserved specifically so that someone, someday, might finish what he'd started. I understood, standing at that gate, that turning back was never really an option my nature would allow me to choose. However clearly, I could see it laid out in front of me. I hadn't touched the gate. I want to state that, as plainly and as clearly as I can, because in the retelling of this story, in the versions I've told to myself in the years since, trying to make sense of it, that detail has remained the single most disorienting piece of the entire evening. I hadn't touched the gate. I hadn't so much as brushed against the low iron fence that ran along the property line, and yet when I lowered my phone, the photograph still glowing on the screen, both the gate and the front door of the house stood open, wide open in fact, in a posture that struck me immediately, with a certainty I couldn't argue myself out of, as patient, as an invitation extended so many times, to so many people, over so many years, that it no longer required the formality of being asked. It had simply learned to wait, with the door already open, confident that eventually, given enough time, given enough grief circulating through the town around it, someone would arrive and walk through. The air that rolled out from the open doorway carried a smell I recognized instantly, viscerally, in a way that bypassed conscious thought entirely and went straight to some older, deeper part of my brain, my father's aftershave, a specific brand, discontinued more than 15 years ago, that I hadn't smelled since I was a small child, leaning into his coat at the front door before school, breathing him in during that brief morning ritual before he left for work, before the world had a chance to touch either of us that day. I stood on that overgrown walkway with that smell washing over me, and my chest ached with something that was worse, somehow, than fear. It was longing. A longing so sudden and so complete that it nearly buckled my knees. The specific, physical ache of missing someone made manifest in scent, in a way that felt less like a memory and more like a summons. I understood, standing there, exactly what the notebook had meant. They don't take you, you give yourself. I understood it not as an abstract warning anymore, not as a philosophical observation scrawled in a dead man's compressed, frightened handwriting, but as a lived, present-tense truth, happening to me in real time, in my own body, as I felt my feet begin to move forward, across the threshold without my conscious permission, drawn by a smell that promised, more powerfully than any words could have, that everything I had lost was waiting just inside. I want to try to describe what that pull actually felt like, because I don't think fear alone captures it, and I don't want to simplify something that was, in its own terrible way, more complicated than simple terror. It felt like the specific ache of standing outside a house you grew up in, years after your family sold it, catching a glimpse through a window of some stranger's furniture, arranged in the rooms where your own life used to happen, and feeling, despite every rational understanding that the house no longer belongs to you, an overwhelming urge to walk in anyway, to reclaim something that time has already taken. It felt like the last few seconds before waking from a good dream, when you can feel the edges of it starting to dissolve, and some deep, animal part of you fights against consciousness, desperate to stay a little longer in the place where the thing you lost is still here. I have never, before or since, felt anything that so completely overrode the ordinary machinery of self-preservation that usually governs a person's body. I remember, even as I crossed the threshold, some small, distant part of my mind, the part that still belonged to the ordinary woman I'd been that morning, drinking coffee in my kitchen 300 miles away, screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to remember my mother's face, my apartment, the life I had built that had nothing to do with any of this. That voice grew fainter with every step I took, not silenced exactly, but overwhelmed, the way a single candle is overwhelmed by daylight, still technically burning but no longer casting any meaningful light of its own. I have thought many times since about what might have happened if I'd found some way to listen to that voice instead, to plant my feet on that overgrown walkway and refuse to go any further, no matter how strongly the smell of my father's aftershave pulled at me. I don't know. I suspect, given everything I now understand about the specific mechanics of this hunger, that it wouldn't have mattered. That the house, or whatever occupied it, would simply have waited, patient as it had always been, for a night when my resistance was weaker, my grief closer to the surface, my resolve worn down by exactly the kind of isolation and longing it had spent generations learning to cultivate in people like me. The hallway stretched on longer than the house's modest exterior should have allowed, a spatial impossibility I registered clearly, even as I kept walking deeper into it, some part of my mind cataloguing the wrongness of it, with the same detached, procedural attention my father would have brought to any anomaly in a crime scene. The walls, which should have been bare, or peeling, or hung with whatever forgotten decor a condemned house accumulates over decades of abandonment, were instead lined with photographs, family photographs, mine. Not my father's pictures of the house, the ones I'd already memorized from the box on my desk. These were different, newer, taken from angles no camera of mine had ever captured, documenting moments of my own life with a completeness that made my skin go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature around me, my childhood birthdays. My college graduation, my mother's hand on my shoulder, a moment I remembered clearly and had never seen photographed from this particular angle. as though someone had been standing just behind and to the left of where I remembered every camera in attendance being positioned that day. And near the end of the hallway, closest to the base of a staircase rising into darkness, a photograph of me sleeping, in my own bed, in my own apartment, taken based on the specific pajamas I was wearing in the image, only the previous week, 300 miles from where I now stood. Something had been watching me long before I ever opened that box. I understood that now, standing in a hallway lined with the evidence of it, with a clarity that settled into my body like ice water. The notebook hadn't survived by accident, hadn't been quietly overlooked by an evidence department and simply forgotten in storage for 3 years by administrative coincidence. It had been given to me, deliberately, patiently, by whatever intelligence organized itself around this house and the grief it seemed to feed on, as bait, as an invitation extended not through an open gate or an open door, but through paper and ink and my father's own careful, familiar handwriting, the one thing in the world I was guaranteed to be unable to resist, following all the way to its source. I walked further down that hallway than I probably should have, my footsteps swallowed almost entirely by a carpet I hadn't noticed until that moment, a deep red runner that seemed too well maintained for a house that had supposedly stood condemned and empty for decades, its fibers thick and undisturbed by dust, in a way that made the whole hallway feel less abandoned and more curated, arranged, maintained specifically for whoever eventually walked through it. I passed a photograph of myself at 7 years old, missing a front tooth, grinning at a camera I didn't remember posing for, standing in a backyard that wasn't ours, though something about the light and the angle of the fence in the background nagged at a memory I couldn't quite place, as though the photograph had been assembled from fragments of a day that had actually happened, stitched together from angles no single camera could have captured. I found myself counting the photographs as I walked, an old habit from childhood, counting things to keep panic from fully taking hold, the way my father had taught me to count backward from 100 by 7s whenever I felt a wave of fear building past what I could manage. I stopped counting somewhere around 40, not because I lost track, but because the sheer volume of it, 40 photographs, and counting, cataloguing a life I hadn't realized was being documented this thoroughly by anyone, let alone something with no business standing behind a camera in the first place, became its own kind of horror, distinct from the individual wrongness of any single image. It wasn't just that I was being watched. It was the duration of it, the patience implied by an archive this complete, built presumably over years, maybe over my entire life, by something that had known, long before I did, that I would eventually end up exactly here, walking this exact hallway, looking at exactly these walls. I reached the end of the photographs, just as the hallway began to narrow slightly, the walls drawing closer together in a way that felt deliberate, funneling, herding me toward the base of the staircase, rising into darkness ahead. I remember thinking, with the strange, detached clarity that sometimes arrives in the middle of genuine terror, that my father must have walked this exact stretch of hallway himself, must have passed these same photographs, or an earlier version of them, before I existed to be photographed at all, on whatever night this house finally decided he had waited long enough, grieved long enough, come close enough, to finally be allowed all the way inside. There was one photograph, near the very end of the hallway, that I haven't been able to describe to anyone until now. And even now I find myself reaching for language that feels inadequate to the specific wrongness of it. It showed my father and me together, in a moment I have no memory of ever occurring, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize, his hand resting on my shoulder, the way it used to when I was small, both of us smiling at whatever camera had captured the image. I would have been perhaps 5 years old in that photograph, based on my size relative to him, which meant, if it was real, if it had actually happened, it would have taken place more than 2 decades before he ever set foot in Hollow Bend at all. I stood in front of that image for a long time, trying to place it, trying to remember a house that matched the one behind us in the frame, and found nothing. No memory, no context, just my own 5-year-old face, smiling with an ease I didn't feel standing there as an adult, and my father's hand on my shoulder, warm even through the flat surface of a photograph that should not have existed. I understood, looking at that image, that whatever curated this hallway hadn't simply documented my life as it happened. It had reached backward too, somehow, constructing or recovering, or perhaps simply fabricating moments that blurred the line between memory and invention so completely that I could no longer trust my own certainty about what had and hadn't happened to me. That uncertainty frightened me more than any of the photographs I could clearly identify as real. Because if it could give me back a moment I never had, a version of my father smiling at me from some year that made no sense, then I no longer knew, standing in that hallway, exactly what it was offering me. Comfort, dressed up as memory, or something closer to a trap, built specifically from the material of my own deepest, least examined longing. The longing, buried under 26 years of ordinary life, for more time with a father I'd lost too early, for photographs that had never been taken, for a past this house seemed perfectly capable of manufacturing on demand. "You came faster than he did," it said. The voice arrived close enough that I felt breath against my neck, dry, papery, and unmistakably wrong, carrying none of the warmth or moisture that breath should carry, as though whatever produced it had only a theoretical understanding of what breathing was meant to feel like. I turned, fast, my whole body flooding with the specific adrenaline of imminent confrontation, and found nothing standing there, just the hallway behind me, the photographs, and a mirror I hadn't noticed on my way in, ornate and old, hanging at the base of the staircase. My own reflection stood in it, and it was wrong, in a way I struggled, in the moment, to fully articulate, even to myself. Standing slightly askew from my actual position, moving a half-second delayed from my movements, so that when I tilted my head, the reflection's head tilted a beat later, close enough to convincing that I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been looking directly for wrongness, primed by everything else I'd already seen that evening, to notice discrepancies I would otherwise have dismissed as trick lighting or exhaustion. The reflection smiled before I did. I stared at that smile for a long moment, cataloguing it the way I'd catalogued everything else that evening. Some detached, procedural part of my mind, still functioning even as the rest of me stood frozen with terror. It wasn't quite my own smile, though it used my own face to produce itself, wider than I've ever managed, the corners pulling further than my own muscles would comfortably allow, as though whatever controlled that reflection had studied the mechanics of my expressions without ever fully understanding the limits my actual body operated within. I thought, absurdly, of nature documentaries I'd watched as a child, footage of certain predators that mimic the calls of other species to lure prey closer, technically accurate in every measurable way, and yet subtly, unmistakably wrong to any creature that had actually heard the real thing. That was what my reflection's smile felt like, a near-perfect forgery, betrayed by the smallest excess of effort. "He's still here," the voice continued, and it no longer came from any single direction. It came from everywhere at once now, the walls and the floor and the ceiling, seeming to breathe the words together in a low, layered chorus that made the hallway itself feel less like a structure and more like a throat. "Would you like to see him? He asks about you. He always asks about you." I remember opening my mouth to respond, though I have no clear memory of what I intended to say, and finding that no sound emerged at all, my voice simply refusing to function in whatever way it had functioned outside on the sidewalk minutes earlier. That refusal frightened me more than the voice itself had. The specific horror of discovering that some fundamental capacity you'd taken entirely for granted, the ability to speak, to make a sound, to assert your own presence into a space, could simply be switched off by something that had decided it no longer wanted to hear from you. I understood, standing silent in front of that wrong, smiling reflection, that I had crossed some threshold beyond simple trespass into territory where the house's rules, whatever they were, now applied to me as completely as they must have applied to my father, to the 6 victims, to the young woman who'd come here looking for answers about him and never left with any. I want to tell you I ran. I want to tell you that some instinct for self-preservation, some inheritance from 26 years of ordinary human survival, finally overrode whatever pull had brought me this far and sent me sprinting back down that impossible hallway toward the open door and the ordinary night beyond it. I didn't. I climbed the stairs instead, my legs moving with a steadiness that felt disconnected from the terror flooding every other part of my body, because some part of me, the part that had inherited my father's specific, fatal inability to leave a question unanswered, understood that I had already come too far to leave without knowing. I want to describe the staircase itself, because I've thought about it often since, turned it over in memory the way you turn over a strange object you can't quite identify. It rose in a tight spiral, tighter than the house's exterior should reasonably have allowed for. The same spatial impossibility that had governed the hallway, now governing the vertical space above it, as though the house's interior obeyed a geometry entirely separate from whatever rules its outer walls suggested. The steps themselves were narrow, worn smooth in the center by what must have been countless footsteps over countless years, a detail that unsettled me more than almost anything else, because a house condemned and boarded for decades shouldn't have stairs worn smooth by traffic. Someone, or something, had been climbing these steps regularly, patiently, for far longer than any official record of the house's abandonment could account for. The voice did not follow me up the stairs, not directly, not in the way a person follows another person, footsteps audible, presence discernible. Instead, it seemed to recede into the structure itself, becoming part of the ambient texture of the house, rather than a distinct thing moving through it. The way a sound you've been hearing for so long eventually stops registering as separate from silence. I climbed in something close to that same silence, my own breathing the loudest sound in the stairwell, each step bringing me closer to a door at the top that stood, like the gate and the front door before it, already open, waiting, patient, in exactly the same way everything else in this house had proven itself to be. I thought, climbing those final steps, about every ordinary staircase I'd ever climbed in my life, the one in my childhood home, worn in different places by different feet, my father's heavier tread distinct from my mother's lighter one, distinct from my own smaller footsteps racing up 2 at a time, as a child eager to reach my bedroom. I thought about how a staircase is meant to be the most ordinary architecture in the world, a simple mechanical solution to the problem of vertical distance, and how this one had been transformed, by whatever occupied this house, into something closer to a ritual passage, a threshold you crossed not just physically, but in some deeper sense too, leaving behind, with each step, a little more of whatever ordinary self you'd walked in as. Every instinct I possessed screamed against the climb, and I climbed anyway, because if there was even the smallest fraction of a chance that he was real, that some version of my father still existed somewhere in this house, still himself, still recognizably him beneath whatever had been done to him, I owed him this. I owed him the courage he had spent my entire childhood trying to teach me, the belief that fear was just missing information, that the only way through was toward the answer, never away from it. I reached the top of the stairs and found myself in a short landing, barely wide enough to stand comfortably, with a single door standing ahead of me, already open, the same patient invitation the house had extended at every threshold so far. I remember pausing there for a moment, my hand resting against the doorframe, feeling the wood beneath my palm, cold, colder than the rest of the house had felt, cold in a way that seemed to radiate outward from the room beyond, rather than simply reflecting the ambient temperature of an old, unheated structure. I remember thinking, in that pause, of every horror story I'd ever half dismissed as a child, every warning about doors you shouldn't open, and understanding, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that none of those stories had ever adequately prepared me for what it actually feels like to stand at one of those doors yourself, weighing a choice that isn't really a choice at all once you've come this far. The room at the top of the stairs was small and nearly empty, containing only a single chair, positioned facing away from the doorway toward the window I now understood, with a sick certainty I had been looking up at through a camera lens on my father's own printed photographs weeks earlier. On the seat of the chair rested his badge, tarnished but unmistakable, his wedding ring beside it, catching what little light remained in the room, and a piece of paper, folded once, with my name written across the front in his handwriting. Fresh, the ink still faintly wet, glistening slightly under the fading light, 3 years after he had supposedly last held a pen. My hand hovered over it, shaking hard enough now that I could see the tremor clearly, even in the dim light, and as I reached toward the paper, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, all at once, cold enough that my breath began to fog in front of my face. And behind the chair, in the shadow, the window's meager light couldn't quite reach. Something shifted, slowly, deliberately. The unmistakable motion of something large and folded and patient, finally beginning to wake after having waited. I understood, in that moment, with total, bone-deep certainty, exactly as long as it had needed to. I stood in that room for what felt, at the time, like an eternity, though I understand now, thinking back on it, that it could only have been a matter of seconds, the mind's sense of time stretching and warping under sufficient terror, the way light bends around something massive enough to distort the space around it. I looked at the badge first, the metal dulled by 3 years of whatever conditions this room maintained, the specific engraving on its surface still legible even in the dim light, his badge number, his name, details I could have recited from memory without needing to see them at all, and yet seeing them there, real, physical, undeniably his, undid something in me that 3 years of grief counseling and careful, managed mourning had never quite managed to touch. I looked at the ring next, and felt a fresh wave of that same longing that had pulled me across the threshold downstairs, because I remembered it specifically, remembered the exact worn place on the band where he used to twist it absently while thinking, a habit so ingrained I could picture his hand doing it right now, could almost hear the small metallic sound it used to make against his other fingers during long silences at the dinner table, while he worked through some problem in his head. I understood, looking at that ring, that whatever remained of my father in this house had been reduced to objects, to artifacts, curated and arranged with the same patient, deliberate care as the photographs in the hallway below, presented to me not as comfort, but as proof. Proof that it had him, proof that it could keep whatever it took, indefinitely, waiting only for the right moment to make use of what it had gathered. I noticed, as I stood there, that the chair itself was old, older than anything else in the room, its wooden frame carved with a level of detail that seemed to belong to some earlier era entirely, the kind of furniture that might have furnished the house when the Halloway family still lived there more than a century ago. I found myself wondering, with a detachment that felt almost clinical, given the terror pressing in on every side of that thought, how many people had sat in that chair before my father, how many badges, how many rings, how many folded notes with someone else's name written across the front had rested on that same worn seat, waiting for the specific grief-shaped visitor who would eventually climb these stairs to claim them. I understood, in that moment, that I was looking at a ritual object, refined over generations, purpose-built for exactly this encounter, and that my father's belongings weren't the first to occupy that chair, and, if the pattern held, if the hunger that governed this house continued unchecked, they wouldn't be the last either. The shifting behind the chair grew louder as I finally reached for the paper, a sound like something large unfolding itself after a long period of stillness, joints or something like joints working against resistance, dry and deliberate. I did not look toward the source of that sound. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I did not turn to look at whatever was rising up behind that chair, whatever had been waiting there, in the dark, long enough for its own patience to become a kind of architecture, load-bearing, holding up the entire structure of what this house had become. I looked only at the paper, at my name in my father's handwriting, and I understood, with a certainty that arrived all at once and completely, that whatever happened in the next several seconds would determine not just whether I survived this room, but what shape my survival would ultimately take. I don't remember leaving Hollow Bend. That absence itself is a kind of evidence I've never been able to explain to my own satisfaction, a gap in my memory that begins somewhere in that upstairs room, my hand outstretched toward my father's handwriting, and ends with me waking behind the wheel of my parked car on Route 9, the sun rising pale and indifferent over the dead cornfields, the note gone from my hand entirely, though its message had somehow burned itself into my memory with a permanence no physical page could have matched. Don't finish what I started. Give them someone else. I sat in that car for a long time before I trusted myself to drive, checking my body the way you'd check for injuries after a fall you don't fully remember taking, running my hands over my arms, my face, half expecting to find some physical evidence of whatever had happened in that room, some mark or wound that would at least give me a place to locate the missing hours. There was nothing, no injury, no obvious sign that anything at all had happened to me, which was, in its own way, more disturbing than any wound could have been. My clothes were dry, unmarked by dust or cobweb, despite everything I remembered about that hallway and that staircase. My phone, when I finally checked it, showed no missed calls, no record of the time that had passed, simply a battery drained further than it should have been, given how little I remembered using it. I drove home in a kind of fog that lasted for days afterward, going through the motions of my ordinary life with the specific, hollowed-out efficiency of someone operating on autopilot, unable to fully process what had happened, and unwilling, in some deep and self-protective way, to try. I told my mother, when she called to check on me, that I'd simply been busy with work, a lie that came easier than I expected, sliding into place beside all the other lies I'd told myself over the preceding weeks. I went back to my freelance projects. I met my friend for coffee again and let her talk about her relationship, nodding at the right places, though I found I could no longer fully focus on anything she said, some part of my attention permanently redirected now toward a door I couldn't stop thinking about, a room, a shape shifting in shadow, a note whose final 6 words I couldn't stop hearing in my father's voice, no matter how hard I tried to quiet them. I noticed changes in myself during those weeks that I'm still not sure how to fully account for. I started sleeping with a light on, something I hadn't done since childhood, unable to tolerate the specific texture of full darkness in a way that felt entirely new, foreign to the person I'd been before that drive to Hollow Bend. I found myself, more than once, standing in front of mirrors longer than necessary, studying my own reflection with a wariness I couldn't fully explain, watching for the smallest delay, the smallest wrongness, though I never found one, not in the ordinary mirrors of my own apartment. I stopped wearing my father's aftershave brand's modern equivalent, which I'd quietly bought myself years earlier without quite admitting why, unable to stand the smell of it anymore, without my chest tightening in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with what that smell had led me toward. I also noticed, though I've been slower to admit this even to myself, a new and unfamiliar comfort with the idea of other people's grief. Where I once would have felt awkward, unsure of what to say to someone freshly mourning a loss. I found myself, in the weeks after Hollow Bend, drawn toward those conversations instead of away from them, asking questions I wouldn't have asked before, listening with an attentiveness that felt less like empathy and more like something closer to appraisal, though I didn't let myself examine that word too closely at the time. I understand now, writing this, that I was changing in ways the house had perhaps intended from the moment it let me leave that upstairs room at all. That whatever it had given me permission to walk out with, it hadn't given for free. I haven't told my mother that I went. I haven't told anyone, not really, not the full truth of it, not what waits in that upstairs room, patient and breathing, and wearing my father's smile like a coat borrowed from someone who will never be coming back to reclaim it. I've told myself, in the months since, that I would never go back, that whatever those final 6 words meant, I would find some other way to live with them, some way that didn't require me to become the kind of person capable of doing what they seemed, with quiet insistence, to be asking of me. I told myself that with real conviction, the same conviction I'd once believed would keep me from ever driving to Hollow Bend at all, and I understand now, looking back, exactly how much that particular kind of conviction is worth. But 3 nights ago, my neighbor knocked on my door. A woman I've spoken to only in passing over the 2 years I've lived in this building. Polite hallway small talk, nothing more. A comment about the weather, a held elevator door, the small, unremarkable courtesies of people who share a building but not a life. She was asking if I'd seen her missing sister's cat, an animal that had apparently slipped out during a recent visit and never come back. Her sister, she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, voice catching slightly on the word, in a way she probably didn't even notice herself doing, had passed away only a few weeks earlier. Unexpectedly, she was still, understandably, grieving, the specific rawness of it visible in her face in a way I recognized immediately, having worn that exact expression myself for longer than I'd like to admit. I stood in my doorway looking at her, feeling something settle into place in my chest that I still don't have adequate language for, something that wasn't quite my own volition and wasn't quite separate from it either, some third thing occupying the space between choice and compulsion that I suspect my father understood far better than he ever wrote down. I thought, in that brief moment, of his letter to my mother, of the words he'd underlined 3 times in a notebook I still haven't been able to bring myself to burn, or bury, or throw away, no matter how many times I've stood over a trash can with it in my hands. They don't take you, you give yourself. I understood, standing in my own doorway looking at a grieving stranger's face, exactly what those words had always meant, and exactly what I was about to become complicit in. And I gave her the address before I even understood why the words were leaving my mouth. I think about her sometimes, now, in the quiet hours, when sleep won't come, and the light I leave on doesn't feel like enough. I wonder whether she's already driven those 4 hours, whether she's already stood at that gate, whether the shape in the window has already begun to smile for her the way it once smiled for me. I tell myself I'll call her, that I'll take back what I said, that I still have time to undo the one truly unforgivable thing I've done since coming home. I haven't called yet. I don't fully understand why. I only know that some part of me, the part that has never once, in my entire life, been able to leave a mystery unfinished, is still waiting, patiently, the way the house itself waits, to find out what happens next.